Alex, who is your favorite player in the NBA?
Khris Middleton.
Before we go any further, do you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yep, my name is Alex. You can find my YouTube channel, AlexHoops, is what I'm probably more commonly known as. But I just do videos analyzing the NBA, doing a lot of film breakdown stuff, X's and O's, stats, trying to find a good blend between, the whole eye test and analytics argument. I'm a tracking data truther. And a big Khris Middleton fan.
So how did you become a fan of Khris Middleton?
Honestly, it's kind of weird because there was never like a set moment in time where I could definitively tell you this is the moment that I became a fan of Khris Middleton. It was very much a situation where it was like, holy cow, like this guy's so stinking good. And then I was a big Giannis fan just because, it's Giannis. It's hard to find people who aren't fans of Giannis. And at a certain point, I realized, not that I was like Stephen A. Smith saying that Khris Middleton is actually Batman and Giannis is Robin, but through watching Giannis so much, I was like, holy cow, Khris Middleton is a insanely good NBA player. Just because he is the kind of second fiddle to Giannis doesn't really detract from how incredible of a player he is and what his capabilities are when you compare it to what a lot of second options are expected to do in the NBA today. He's a very unique second option, which I think has made him a really interesting player to watch throughout his career.
Yeah, so for Khris Middleton, I've always thought of him as kind of that perfect second option, because I don't think a second option is just a player that you can look at and say, oh, he plays second fiddle. A second option is a player that, those stretches, they have to be the guy and have to take over the game. And I think Khris Middleton is a player that fits that perfectly because of not only his skill set, but also he has that mindset of I can take over a game if I need to. He doesn't have to all the time, but, contenders are built off having at least two of those guys that you can trust when the other is resting. And Khris Middleton has been that, obviously. He won a title. He had some great performances in the finals, obviously. So that's what makes Khris Middleton such a fun player for me. Is there anything that makes him specifically fun for you to watch when he plays?
Well, you've played basketball with me, so you know how much I love mid-range shots. That's my bread and butter is just taking pull-up mid-ranges. And I think that's one of the other reasons why I'm such a big fan of Khris Middleton is because not that I've modeled my game after Khris Middleton, because I don't think anyone's ever said that in the history of humanity. But besides Keegan Murray, I just think that it's really interesting how when you have a second option nowadays, it's oh, they're going to be the guy who's camped out on the wing, just knocking down shots off the catch, or they're going to be passing. Their responsibility is not very on the ball or creation oriented. It's very much a fit within the flow of the offense type of role. But with Khris Middleton, I think what he does really well is blending the more traditional responsibilities of a second option with what you'd expect from a shot creating guard. With his mid-range career, he has really, really good footwork. He's fantastic out of the triple threat. He's a very underrated ball handler, and the fact that he can just kind of flip that switch sometimes and alter between those two things is really impressive, because I don't think there's many players who are able to do that so well without it being a detriment to their team. Because sometimes guys will flip that switch too often, and some guys will not flip that switch enough. But with Khris Middleton, I think he seems to have a very good understanding of okay, teams are really honing in on Giannis right now. It's time for me to flip that switch and just start putting up shots. And he'll do that. And then when Giannis is cooking, he's all right, I'm just gonna run the pick and roll with Giannis until it stops working, and then he does that. It's like, dude, he can do anything. Like he's the Giannis and Khris Middleton pick and roll. And I know you wanted to talk about stats a little bit later, but I think the Giannis and Khris Middleton pick and roll last year averaged something like 1.7 points per possession in the pick and roll, which is absurd.
Yeah.
Like
so,
that's by far the most efficient shot in basketball.
So he's like he's a very lineup versatile player, or lineup flexible player, like I like to say on my channel. Which is like, those are the most valuable kind of players in the NBA outside of like those guys you build around, because you can throw them anywhere. And I think that you can put Khris Middleton on any team in the league, and there's a role for him to play. Like, you could put him on Boston, and even though they have Jalen and they have obviously Jason Tatum, who's like an MVP favorite, he would find a way to fit into a role on that team. Or you can put him on like a super stacked team and he can fit in. Or even on like a team that maybe isn't as talented. I'm not saying he could be like a superstar, but he can be like the best player on a team that's like a 4 or 5 seed. Like, that's the way I feel about him. It's just, when you have a player that literally can do so much for you, you sometimes forget that when he's been in the role that he's been in really since around like 2015.
Right. And it's funny because people look at Khris Middleton's contract and they're always like, oh my gosh, this is such a terrible contract. Like, oh, like we have to get rid of him. But the truth is, the talent and the ability and the versatility that Khris Middleton provides to a team actually makes him a pretty solid trade piece. Like, if you were a team looking to add like a quote-unquote second or quote-unquote third star, like, Khris Middleton would be perfect for that, because he's such a seamless fit for whatever you need him to do. Yeah,
and again, like we talked about, that's just so valuable to have in any NBA era, you know. Again, like, I think we're both in agreement. Like, we don't think he could be like the number one guy in a contender necessarily, but he's like perfect for any role outside of that. And I think that people look at the fact that he is a second option or a third option and say like, oh, like, and they don't talk about him as much. But at the same time, I think he's an incredible player, and I don't think the fact that he isn't only like the top like 2% of the NBA has the ability to do should like take away from that. But you know, I think he's also a very unique player on tape when you watch him play. I describe him as mechanically creative, because I view a lot of his movement skills as very robotic and mechanical, but the way he plays is very fluid and creative. I think he has incredible counters as a shot creator.
Oh, yeah.
His ability to get to his spots as a guy that's not a great athlete, not a bad one, but not a great athlete, is among the best, like, maybe ever, as far as guys that aren't like super athletic. I just think that it's a weird blend that you just don't see, because usually you see guys that their movement skills are robotic and they are robotic as a player, and then you see guys that are very fluid as athletes. They are very creative as players. Like, I think Jalen Green's a perfect example of it, where you have a guy he's a very fluid and flexible athlete, and he plays that way. Where I think that, again, Khris Middleton, he plays very fluid and very flexible and creative, but his movement skills are very robotic and mechanical. And I find that interesting.
It's all very calculated.
Yeah.
I think a way that I've always kind of thought about it in my own head, and I'm not saying that like talent-wise he is on par with these guys. I'm saying in terms of his isolation scoring and his approach to, you know, countering the defense and things like that. Khris Middleton is almost like a blend between Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, in that Kawhi Leonard is very robotic and everything is very premeditated and it's very calculated, and you can tell like it is just the culmination of so much repetition over and over and over and over again. And Paul George is very much like he's just fluid. He's very, very smooth. And to me, Khris Middleton is like he's robotic, he's mechanical, but it's so smooth and it doesn't feel like telegraphed to the defense. It's like, okay, no, he's just done this so many times that it looks effortless, but it's also just like technically speaking, very, very sound.
And I can agree with that. Obviously, we're not saying that he's a mix of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. That would be the best player in the league. Like,
exactly.
And I think that leads to a whole other conversation for a whole other time about like the idea of you can compare people to all-time greats if you're just comparing specific parts of their games, but not saying that they're overall the same player. Like for me, like again, like I mentioned with Jalen Green, I think athletically, I think that Jalen Green is like the first like real like glidey, sort of floaty athlete we've seen since like Michael Jordan. Like that's like the closest thing I think I've probably seen when you compare the tape. I'm not saying Jalen Green's Michael Jordan, but that specific part of their games, and like you mentioned with Khris Middleton, like yes, he is like kind of has that mechanical movement skills like a Kawhi, but he's very creative like a Paul George in the way he uses counters and things like that. Like we're not saying this, like we're not saying like again he's the defender that Kawhi Leonard is or was, or we're not saying that he is like again like the two-way player that even like Paul George is. I don't think he's a better defender than either of those guys. Those are two of the best wing defenders of their generation, maybe ever. So I do think that that's a point that has to be made. I know people in the comment section will still be act like, oh, he said he's a combination of Kawhi Leonard and Paul George. It happens. It's the YouTube comment section.
Yeah.
But I think that we're kind of on the same page as far as like that goes with the tape side of things with Khris Middleton, where he's a blend of two opposite extremes that you just wouldn't put together, and you wouldn't, because you wouldn't say someone's mechanically creative. Well, actually, you might, but you're not gonna act like
that's almost like an oxymoron because when you think about like creativity, nothing about creativity is ever thought of to be mechanical. But in basketball, it's like, well, it works because like if you practice something over and over and over and over again to where it's almost second nature, it's gonna look almost mechanical. But then you have to string together those various things, and that's where the creativity comes in.
Yeah, and with Khris Middleton, it very much is like that, where he has a bunch of like premeditated thoughts and premeditated ideas of what he wants to do, but he also has the idea in the back of his mind of what if they lead me to my spot, or what if they see it coming, or cut me off, or stonewall me, like things like that. He understands how to do that, and that's to me is always something that has separated like the great playmakers and the great shot creators. Is you can have the handle, you can have the ability to shoot the basketball, hit tough shots, but what makes the guys like the Luka Doncic's, like the James Hardens, like the Damian Lillards, Khris Middleton, obviously the player who we're talking about in this video, is they have the ability to know how to go off that script. And the other players I mentioned, I feel like it's more evident just based off the fluidity that they play with, minus maybe James Harden. I think James Harden plays a bit mechanically, but Khris Middleton isn't like that. Even when you compare him like Harden, who I think is kind of mechanical, and the way he goes like between the legs all the time, step backs, things like that. But Khris Middleton, it's to an even more extreme extent. And I think that's so interesting when you watch him play, because it makes me wonder, like, how do people try and defend it?
Right.
But are there any, because we talked about stats earlier, are there any interesting stats that you wanted to talk about? Because I know we talked about the pick and roll stuff with Giannis, but are there anything else that kind of stood out to you about him statistically as a player?
Yeah, I think like probably one of the biggest things for me that I think always flies under the radar, and I've talked about it a little bit, is just how good of a passer he is, and he kind of doesn't really get a ton of credit for it. Like last 4 seasons, he's averaging 5 assists per game, pretty much 4.8 on 2.5 turnovers a game, which is not like, that's pretty solid. That's pretty efficient passing. I just think when you talk about the fact that Khris Middleton is a small forward, the past 5 years, 6, 7 years of his career, he's played small forward. And for him to be as good of a passer as he is, I just think that's an aspect of his game that does not get the credit that it probably deserves, just because, he plays next to Giannis, and we kind of associate his role with more of like a scoring role. But the truth is, not just in the Giannis Middleton pick and roll, but in general, he's able to orchestrate offense pretty well for a quote unquote score first guy. I'm not saying he should be a starting point guard for a team. I'm not sure if you give him like the full reins like that, but the fact that the Bucks have always had the ability to get funky with how they use Middleton as a ball handler, I just think it says a lot to how well-rounded of a player he is. Because we've talked about his shot creation. Defenses really do key in on Middleton a fair amount, and that's what allows Giannis to be so effective, is just because, all right, we're going to give the ball to Middleton, we're going to let him create for a little bit, and the defense is like, well, now we have to guard Middleton. Well, Middleton's such a good passer, he's going to start passing it to Giannis, who's now open, because the defense was so focused on Middleton. And I think that's just such an asset for, not only his game, but for the Bucks as a whole. And then not only his passing ability, which I'm a firm believer is incredibly underrated, but just how efficient he is. Like, he's insanely efficient.
Dude, 50, 40, 90.
Obviously. Yeah. That bummed me out so much when right before the bubble, he was like 2 shots away from, I think he had to have made like 2 more shots for him to have gotten 50, 40, 90, and then the season obviously got cut short, and it was like, well, not happening. But I think he'll eventually get back to the efficiency that he was at.
This is
maybe not quite as high, but
this season's been like outlier, like bad shooting splits, to the point where it's like, okay, he's just getting, like, you can clearly just point to this, like, this is not normal, like something else is going on. Like,
he's definitely like playing back into it, I think.
To speak on the passing thing a little bit, I also think another reason his passing may not get talked about as much is the fact that they do have Drew Holiday, who's like a 6 to 7 assist per game guy in his own right.
Right.
And I believe Holiday has led the Bucks in assists per game since he's joined them. So, Drew Holiday, another relatively underrated player in his own right, but I think I agree with, like, the passing obviously is a real skill set with him, and that's something that all greats. Again, that's something that separates like those shot creators and those scorers. To me, is it's weird to say that passing is an important part of scoring, but your ability to pass out of double teams, your ability to pass in general as a scorer opens up your game so much. And for Khris Middleton, I think it's led to him being like this super efficient player. One of the best 3-point shooters of his like generation, things like that. Again, playing with Giannis does help. Like playing with one of like the most valuable gravitational players like ever does help. But you also have to hit the shots. You also have to have the ability. And I do find it interesting that Khris Middleton is a player that he does utilize the mid range a lot. But he's also like a high volume like 3-point shooter.
Right.
Like he averages like over the last, like really since he broke out into stardom, like he's averaging like no less than 5 3-point attempts a night.
Yeah.
So
he, for a guy who shoots as much as he does, the fact that he's been able to be as efficient as he is with the type of shots that he's been taking, it's like very unusual. It's not something that happens often at all. Yeah.
And I don't know if you have any thoughts on his shooting form, but I think he has like picture perfect like textbook.
Oh my gosh,
form.
yeah, it's flawless. I think
it's like it's like one motion, very fluid.
Right.
Great shot preparation.
Technically speaking, just amazing fluid shot.
Yeah. Like I think he has some of the best shot preparation in the league. I think that's something that kind of goes unnoticed with some players. Like, so with, like, some players, like, they're good shooters, but, like, they're limited because their shot prep just isn't good. They're not ready to just catch and fire.
Right. I think something he does really well is when he's receiving a pass, he's like low by the time the ball gets to him, so he doesn't have to dip down into a shot. That's the problem for a lot of 3-point shooters is like when they're catching the ball, they have to catch it, then they have to bring it down, then they have to bring it back up and actually take the shot. If you start low and you catch the ball and you're ready to just shoot it and go up immediately, I mean, that eliminates a lot of time that your defender has to close out on you, and it's something that works to Khris Middleton's advantage really, really well.
And obviously, I think that also speaks to his versatility because, like, his shot prep doesn't just help him in regards of catch and shoot stuff. He's also has great shot prep off the dribble, like doing pull-ups, things like that. He's just like, if like I'm not because usually you wouldn't think of like obviously the name you're gonna think of is like if you're gonna make a score in a lab, who would it's Kevin Durant, obviously, but like not like, sort of like the non-obvious names like a Kevin Durant, like Khris Middleton's like one of the first names I come up with when we talk about like wing scorers, as far as like if you were to build like this wing scorer in a lab, like he's one of the first names that comes up to me at least. But do you have any games of Khris Middleton that you watched that you remember that like stand out to you?
I mean, a lot of them are really the 2020 playoffs, or the 2021 playoffs rather. I mean, there's just so many great games, and specifically, like the obvious one is the 40-point game against Phoenix, which, I mean, just an insane game. 33 shots, 45% from the field, 3 of 8 from 3, just insanely good scoring, and it helped them win that game. But the other games that come to mind are the 30-point games against the Hawks, which that Hawks series, I mean, they didn't have Giannis for a good chunk of that series, and it was like, okay, it's time for Khris Middleton to be, the quote-unquote Batman while Giannis is out. And, he's able to do that. And I think my favorite games are the games where Khris Middleton has the opportunity to step up and be like, all right, I'm the guy. It's my job to score. It's my job to put the points on the board. And a lot of times he comes through. Sometimes he doesn't, that's for sure. But
and that's why he's the second option, not the guy that you was leading your team, and that's fine. Like again, only like 2% of the best league in the world has the ability to do that at a consistent rate.
Right.
I found a fun game for him as well. But you can keep going.
The other one that I was going to mention was I don't know who all remembers this, but it was back in the 2020 season. The COVID season, I guess the pre-COVID season. He had a 51-point game.
Yeah, I have that game pulled up right now.
Okay, cool. That game was nuts, and the tape from that game is ridiculous. Like, if you want to see a guy just like completely locked in scoring, that's the game. And he had 51, 10, and 6. Like, it wasn't just
like,
scoring.
Basically everything that we've talked about in this video. I found interesting. Eric Bledsoe had like 34 points and like 10 assists in that game. And like Eric Bledsoe's like kind of falling out of public favor, obviously, for some other stuff. But
he's in China now too.
Yeah, so there's that. And he had a great battle with like Bradley Beal, who is. I'm not comparing the two as players, obviously, but I do think there is a world where Bradley Beal is like that Robin to like a Giannis level player, and he can have like similar success that Khris Middleton's had. I think statistically, from a pure statistical perspective, as far as like your basic point per game, rebound per game numbers, like stuff like that, Beal obviously has the advantage, but Beal's also been the main option on the team. Where I don't think there's been any point in Khris Middleton's career where he's been the guy.
Right.
But
I mean, not even in Detroit when that was like, his original
Greg
spot.
Monroe's team back then. But I found interesting. Khris Middleton, not a big foul draw guy. Like, doesn't draw a lot of contact, which I found interesting. another thing, he has one of the most impressive point to minute production seasons probably of the last 10 years. During that COVID season.
Yeah.
He averaged 20.9 points per game and 29.9 minutes per game. Per 36 minutes, that's
crazy.
Per 36, that's 25.2 points per game, 7.4 rebounds per game, 5.1 assists per game. Which, if you're talking about, he puts up those numbers, on a team that won 56 games, was on pace to win, 60 before the season got cut. So, you talk about that, oh, wow, it's an MVP kind of, that's all NBA, kind of season. But because, again, it doesn't look as impressive with this 26-4. It's good, and he was an all-star. But, I think that part is just, and again, that's also, the Bucks have a few of those guys. Giannis is another example of, a guy that's just so impressive minute-to-point production perspective. Khris, it kind of shocks me that Khris also didn't make an All-NBA team in his career so far.
Yeah, that's
and that is
something that always is just weird. It makes sense. I'm not saying Khris Middleton should have 100% been All-NBA. I get it.
Guard forward, it's tough.
Yeah,
you'll get the guards that he would have to go up against, and there's so many MVP candidate guards, and even the guys that weren't MVP candidates, Damian Lillard, it's just he's having some of the best scoring seasons by a point guard ever. Right. And then the forwards and the wings, you got Kevin Durant, Giannis, LeBron, all these guys. So competition's stiff, and it makes more sense when you think about the talent in the league. 'Cause I think the league is as talented as it's ever been now, but at the same time, it's he was the second best player on a team that won 60-plus games, a team that was on pace to win 60 games, and the team that won the NBA Finals. And the fact that he never was made an All-NBA team does kind of surprise me. The same way it sucks that Jimmy Butler has never made an All-NBA second team in his career. But, yeah, that 51-point game was really just what displayed and all. But speaking, I guess we kind of talked about it already. The fact that, with the All-NBA stuff, what makes you think he's underrated? Because I think it's a combination of a few things that kind of makes him underrated to, the general public. There's probably several factors. I think playing alongside Giannis is probably the biggest, because I think the question that a lot of people ask is if Khris Middleton wasn't playing next to Giannis, he probably wouldn't be this good. Now, I disagree. I disagree with that as well. But
I think they benefit each other a lot. I think one of the reasons Giannis is able to be as effective as he is. Not saying obviously he spent the whole beginning of the season without Khris Middleton. He was still insane. But I think you get the best version of Giannis when you're getting the best version of Khris Middleton, and vice versa. They complement each other really well. But I think that's one of the reasons Khris Middleton's probably underrated, is just because, he plays next to the best player in the NBA. It's just, but also, role-wise, when you're not the guy doing all the scoring, when you're, Khris Middleton has games where he scores 11 points.
Yeah.
And then he'll have a game where he scores 30. When you're not a guy who's going, he'll average 20 for the season, but it's one of those situations where, how many of those games is he scoring 20? Or is it more a lot of games he's scoring 15 and then a lot of games he's scoring 25?
Yeah.
How much does it fluctuate? What's the standard deviation there? So depending on, any random game in January that you tune into, are you tuning into a 15-point game or are you tuning into a 35-point game?
Yeah.
Which one is it? Which version are you seeing? So you kind of have to, he's a player where you have to watch the full body of work to really kind of see all of the nuance there. But really, I think that just plays a lot into him being underrated. It's just he is, and I am capable of saying something negative about Khris Middleton. He can be very inconsistent. There's plenty of memes that go around every single season about Khris Middleton and how, some nights you'll watch him and you're like, this is the worst player in the NBA, and then some nights you'll watch him and you'll be like, this is literally Michael Jordan.
It's like Drew Holiday's his teammate Drew Holiday's like kind of similar in that way. Like there were nights that
right,
he'll like
exactly.
just smoke a bunch of laps, like what's going on, and then there were nights like he might be the best player in the floor tonight.
Right, exactly.
I also think being in Milwaukee is a bit of a factor into this as well. I wouldn't say at this point Milwaukee's like a small market. You know, they have popular athletes like Giannis, and Aaron Rodgers for better or for worse is popular.
It's still perceived as
it's
a small
still
market.
And you know, I think about like I don't draw too much to football. But like outside of like Devontae Adams, it's like no one really talks from the national perspective. No one talks about Milwaukee outside of like their star. Like they don't talk about much outside of like Aaron Rodgers or Giannis Antetokounmpo.
Right.
Like nobody talks about as much about like Drew Holiday or Khris Middleton, or they don't talk about like Jordy Nelson or Devontae Adams is like the one exception. But like no one really talks about Greg Jennings.
Right.
Unless you like know that very iconic video about him carrying the team to the end zone. But you know, I think that I don't think it's like I think he would be more known in the bigger market. Like I definitely think so. If he was in Chicago, or if he was in like a New York or California, or specifically like LA, I think he would be more known. But I just think at the same time it's like I don't equivalent like market size to a player's ability. Obviously, I don't think most people don't do that. But you know, like when I watch him play, it's just like I enjoy watching him play. You obviously enjoy watching him play. That's why we're making this video. But I do see why people may not like him as much. Malcolm Brogdon's like that. Like when Malcolm Brogdon was in Indiana, where I think he's a fun player to watch. You think it is. We also both like have basically dedicated our entire time to making basketball videos on YouTube.
Right, exactly.
So we're going to be more in tune with players like that. I don't mean that to be elitist, like, oh, I'm a better fan than you. I'm more of a hardcore fan. I hate people like that. But it's just, I get it. I totally get also why like, he's not maybe talked about as much as you would think, even though I think he's an incredible player.
Well, it's also like if you're only tuning into, you know, a couple NBA games every single week, do you really want to do the gamble with Khris Middleton of like, okay, which version am I going to get? Yeah. To me, that's part of the fun with Khris Middleton is like, are we getting the good Khris? Because I'll be watching games with my fiance, and we'll be watching a Bucks game, and I'll be like, oh my gosh, Khris Middleton sucks. He's washed. Like his career's over. Like. Just completely in despair, and then he'll make like a turnaround fadeaway in the post, and I'm like, he's the greatest player of all time. So it's like I enjoy that gamble of like, okay, which one am I gonna get tonight? Like that's fun to me. But if you're you know a quote unquote casual NBA fan, which I don't think there's anything wrong with being a casual NBA fan. To be honest, you want to pick the player that's like consistent and consistently going out there and putting up big games. Yeah, exactly.
And which, to be honest with you, like I think being on social media enough and making content for as long as I've had and knowing how this works, I think some people that are like, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but I think like, you know, I think the biggest basketball community on the internet is Twitter.
Right.
That's still a very small percentage of NBA fans.
Exactly.
Like there's a world outside of Twitter, and I think that people need to realize, and I think, you know, with All-Star voting coming up, I think more people are going to realize just like, casuals are the majority of fans, and that's okay, because like not everyone has time to dedicate their lives to basketball. People have lives outside of just watching basketball games. I have a life outside of watching basketball games. You do as well. It's just we dedicate more of that time to it. But I get it. Like again, like I think it's fun to watch. You think it's fun to watch, but like you know, there are more fun plays for some people to watch from a casual perspective. Like.
For sure.
And I do think the fact that he's not like he doesn't put himself in the big market. Like I think there are guys that like, are known, like despite the fact that you know maybe they aren't like the best player in the team, but it's because like they put themselves in like a market, and you know you don't see many Khris Middleton commercials. He doesn't seem like a guy that likes to promote himself. Yeah. It's like I don't know if he even has like a social media. Like I'm sure he probably has an Instagram. Like I don't know.
It's like the least active thing.
Yeah. Which is funny, it's like Jokic is the most extreme version of that, which is hilarious for a top 2 player. But with Middleton, it's just like he just doesn't put himself out there, and that's okay. Some guys just want to hoop. Like
that's another thing that I think just really makes me enjoy Khris Middleton is like there's no drama with Khris Middleton. There at the beginning of his career in Milwaukee, there was a little bit of drama, but that's besides the point. But dude just wants to play basketball. Like he's not interested in the glitz and glamour of being an NBA player. Like dude just shows up, puts in the work, and goes home. And that's kind of just like, I think there's something relatable to that as an NBA fan. Like it's a lot harder for me to relate to the guy who's, and this is not me like giving any grief or dissing anyone who shows up in like high fashion or anything like that. I think, some people really like that. But just for me, it's like, that's not particularly relatable. And I find something to relate in with the players like the Kawhis and the Middletons that just kind of like, I'm showing up, I'm hooping, I'm going home.
And, Khris Middleton's a great example of it. And I do think it's fun to have players that like express themselves. Like, I love Russell Westbrook.
Yeah, for sure.
Russell Westbrook's like one of my favorite players
fun.
Ever because of that.
Exactly.
Because he is who he is. But for me, like, what I enjoy with players is they are who they are. They don't try to be what they aren't.
I think that's the onus of what I'm trying to say is like being yourself and not trying to like, you're not overdoing it. You're not forcing it, right?
Because you feel you're forced to be what you were. And I think again, I'm learning a lot of the stuff to football. Look at Russell Wilson and compare it to like Cam Newton, where I'm not saying Russell Wilson's a bad dude, but you can get the vibe that he's kind of fake. Where they tried to force Cam Newton into that box early on, and then eventually he's like, no, I'm going to be myself. I'm going to be extravagant and wear a bunch of goofy hats and be who I am and be what I'm comfortable being. And I always just respect people in general. That's a life thing. Like, I just, I'm not going to like hate you because you feel like you have to do something to fit certain requirements because like that's not in my control. But I also respect people that just are who they are. And they do what they want to do. And Khris Middleton, again, like he's just a guy that wants to go out there, hoop, and it's not about like being a brand. And it's okay to be a brand, but like just Khris Middleton doesn't think he needs to build up that brand. But are there any players from the past that he kind of reminds you of?
So it's kind of hard with him. Like there are definitely like players that you can look at that you can say he resembles, but it kind of gets back to the argument we were talking about earlier with like when you say he has aspects of Kawhi and Paul George, it's like you're not saying he was as good as those players. You're saying that he has aspects of his game. There are certain talents that he possesses. There's a certain way that he plays that resembles this, and obviously his shooting is very reminiscent of like. His mid-range shooting, rather, is very reminiscent of Michael Jordan. I've always called Khris Middleton like a diet Kevin Durant. Not that Kevin Durant's a player from the past, but like, they're both these taller, quote unquote, shooting guards or forwards that are just insane snipers. And those are really the players that he reminds me of. And then just the thing that sets him apart from those kind of more historic players is just the fact that he has such a wide array of talents outside of just like mid-range scoring.
I do find it funny that he's on the Milwaukee Bucks. He wears number 22 because I think a player that a lot of people draw comparisons with is Michael Redd. And I'm not comparing the two 1-to-1 obviously because I feel it gets lazy. It's like the whole argument. Every tall, skinny guy that can shoot a basketball and dribble a little bit is the next Kevin Durant. Like I just don't like that stuff.
But I think there's some Rashard Lewis too.
Oh, I didn't think of Rashard, but I just think it's funny because like you see Bucks with like he does. I think part of it is number 22. They have similar frames, both around like 6'6", 6'7", 220. And I do think like you can look at like peak Michael Redd, which is funny because I think the best version of Michael Redd is not the version that made an All-Star team. But like what he put up like 27, like 4 and like 3. I think a few more assists for Khris Middleton, but that's something that Khris Middleton could put up if like Giannis wasn't there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is like, you know, Khris Middleton probably looks more like a 25 point per game scorer if he's the one taking, 20 shots a night. It's just he doesn't.
It's a less extreme version of what I view in like Manu Ginobili, where like if Manu Ginobili had his own team, Manu Ginobili is like putting up like numbers that would have you like putting him in like top 10 shooting guards of all time debates.
Oh yeah.
Like, I think you could argue about like, his numbers just aren't there. And but Khris Middleton, I think, has put up better numbers than Manu because Khris Middleton's the second option and Manu was like the third option. But I do think like there is a world where Khris Middleton puts up maybe slightly better numbers, but I don't think he would trade that in for what happened in 2021. Like that's something I always think about.
We're gonna talk about because I know you want to talk about one particular thing towards the end, but I agree. I don't think he would trade having his own team for what he has.
But speaking, we talked about some players in the past, like Versatility, who I think is a player that I down the line I might make a video about on my own, where it's just like because I think he was so ahead of his time.
Oh my gosh, Matt Issa did an amazing article about Rashard Lewis. That's honestly one of my favorite pieces of basketball work I've ever seen anyone do because I'm a big fan of the stretch big.
Yeah. But speaking now, we don't talk about players from the future though. One thing that stood out to me was Devin Vassell. Was a name that kind of came to mind.
I can see that.
Vassell got some Khris Middleton comparisons coming out of Florida State. I remember that. I loved Devin Vassell when he came out. I had him as a top 10 guy in that class. And he's proven he's like averaging like 24 and 4 this season. Great 3-point shooter. I think he has better defensive potential. Because I think like Devin Vassell can legitimately be one of the best wing defenders in basketball. When he figures that, but I think offensively, kind of reminds you a bit like he does take a few mid-range shots, but someone I think like ideally he's like your number 2 or number 3 on a really good team. Right. Hopefully for the Spurs' sake, that's maybe like Scoot Henderson or maybe Victor Wembanyama. But I see a lot of like that the similar roles. Obviously Keegan Murray's a player who's kind of modeled. He's like again like the first player I've ever seen like this open like I model my game after Khris Middleton, and you see it in the way he moves. I don't think he's as creative as Khris Middleton.
I think there's a level of ball handling that kind of comes into play, and also your actual creation.
They play different positions. I think Khris Middleton's like a 2-3 type, where Keegan Murray's a 4. I think Keegan Murray is a 4 in the modern NBA.
Definitely.
It's weird because there are some guys I think like can play some of the roles to him that Khris Middleton does in the peak, but that's a very big generalization of it. I'm not comparing them as players necessarily, but another thing that came to mind, sort of with the movement skills, because I do think there's a bit of disconnect with Khris Middleton from his upper body movement skills to his lower body movement skills, and it doesn't affect his game. He's been incredible, obviously. But that sort of aspect of him kind of reminds me a bit of like Jabari Smith in a way, as far as some of the movement skills. And the way they shoot. The way they shoot kind of reminds me of that a bit, where Khris Middleton kind of reminds me of that in a way of like, it doesn't, he's a much better dribbler than Jabari Smith is.
Right.
But he doesn't look like he knows how to dribble. He's very upright, but he does know how to dribble.
Right. I definitely see that. There's one player that really sticks out to me, and I actually see more parallels than just like their game. And honestly, Brandon Ingram
that's a good one.
Is a lot more similar to Khris Middleton than people. I'm not saying I think Khris Middleton or Brandon Ingram is probably going to be. If you're talking ceilings, I think Brandon Ingram's probably not a little bit higher. I think he's probably. Has a much higher ceiling than Khris Middleton at this point in Khris Middleton's career. But, the parallels are pretty interesting. Like, Khris Middleton played alongside a big man, a very dominant big man in Giannis. Brandon Ingram is this mid-range assassin. He's a great floor stretcher. He has budding passing abilities.
Yeah.
He's become an underrated rebounder. Khris Middleton
Especially
played
at his
alongside
size.
a dominant big man. He's a mid-range sniper, great three-point shooter, underrated passer, underrated
Yeah.
there's a lot of parallels between these two players, and that's not to say that Brandon Ingram's ceiling is Khris Middleton.
I think his
I'm saying
higher, but I do see the
Oh yeah,
parallels.
exactly. But to me, Brandon Ingram is like what would
I think
like a star version of Khris Middleton look like?
I think with Ingram, it's interesting because I think Ingram is what, like, Khris Middleton, like, the idea of what his development was like is, like, the idea of, like, you were projecting him to be what we know Khris Middleton is now, but, like, earlier on, because I think something that's always been underrated with Ingram has been his passing, like you said, and entering the league, I thought he was a great passer, and I think people, like, with Ingram in particular, they don't understand just how young he was when he entered the league. I always put this into perspective. Like, he was and this is true with Zion as well. These guys, they were a year younger than, like, 8 of the last, like, 10 top 5 picks when they entered the league. Like a whole year younger than them. Guys that are born in, like, the summer and the fall and winter, they usually aren't a part of, like, the normal high school graduating class. And for Ingram in particular, he was the youngest player in the league I believe he was the youngest player in the league when he entered. But he always, like, had high feet. He was a high field player, high energy player, but I always saw the passing that a lot of people didn't, and people always tried to pencil in the Kevin Durant comparisons, because of course they do. He was a number 2 overall pick, like Kevin Durant. He's tall and can shoot, like Kevin Durant, but I always viewed him more as a point forward type than like a true scorer. And I think I never thought about the Ingram comparison. I like that one. I think Ingram's another player. You can talk about him being, like, pretty underrated.
For sure, without a doubt.
I think he's more known because there's just more, like, he's been in more big markets. He went to Duke. He played for he was a top pick. The Pelicans get so many national TV games, and rightfully so, by the way. But I think Ingram. I never thought about Ingram as a player that you look at and say, "Wow, he can be." I never thought about that, but I do see some, like, a higher ceiling version of what Khris Middleton is.
It's like if Khris Middleton had perfect development, you might get Brandon Ingram. And Brandon Ingram is very much like a star level player. Like, Khris Middleton's kind of like that fringe star, but Brandon Ingram is he is a star player.
Again, I think you can also make the argument. If you put Ingram next to Giannis, like, you would still get similar results. But I don't think that's a great measure to compare players to, necessarily, because I always use, like, Kobe Bryant and Tracy McGrady as an example of this, where I think you put Tracy McGrady next to Shaquille O'Neal and they win the same amount of titles. I still think Kobe's a better player all time regardless of that. Or, like, it's not as simple as switching situations. I think that Kevin Garnett has maybe just as many rings, or definitely has more rings if he's on the Spurs in the place of Tim Duncan. That doesn't mean I think he's a better player than Tim Duncan all time. Like, it's just not how it works. But I do think Ingram in particular is a player that, you know, you could put in that Khris Middleton role. Because I think he's learned how to play the game more off ball as the years have gone along, and he's learning how to play because, you know, believe it or not, like, he's played with a lot of great players. Like, you know, obviously, he played with LeBron. Sure. Didn't really like LeBron. Not the biggest LeBron fan. Very highly publicized. He does not the big. He didn't like his time there, and I understand that. He was in trade rumors all the time, having to worry about, like, will he have to move, which is a whole other topic. But, you know, I think we see, like, the fit with Zion isn't perfect, but it works enough.
Yeah.
Like, I think they beat Phoenix with Zion. They beat Phoenix last year with Zion.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, without a doubt. Without a doubt.
But I love that comparison, but I think, you know, it's time we kind of wrap this up. What would you say is the case for Khris Middleton to make the Hall of Fame?
So, we kind of touched on this earlier, and you said that you don't think Khris Middleton would trade his career that he's had so far for, like, the opportunity to be a first option, and I agree. You know, he won that championship in 2021. He's been a 3-time All-Star. He's, in my opinion, one of the most valuable second-round picks ever.
Yeah.
For a 39th overall pick to turn out to be a 3-time All-Star in the second option on a championship caliber team. He's got an Olympic gold medal.
Yeah.
Do I think he has like a concrete case to make the Hall of Fame? Do I think it's like a 100% guaranteed thing? No, not at all. He's very much a player that I see as like he might be able to, depending on how the rest of his career plays out, of course. He's one of those players who could sneak in a down year. But, 3-time All-Star, gold medal, championship. He might rack up one or two more championships with Giannis before.
Yeah. I think that would be if he wins to go championship too, and as like the number 2 guy, I think that would wrap up his case. I think it also depends on
if he wins
who
another
else
championship this year with Giannis as the second option, he's easily without question.
I think it also depends on who else makes it, because I'm not saying like I would have it, but I definitely see the case with like Andre Iguodala making the Hall of Fame. He was important to like a bunch of title teams, and if he makes it, Khris Middleton has to make it at that point.
Right.
And I'm not saying that to discredit Andre Iguodala. I think Andre Iguodala is another one of those guys like historically is like pretty underrated. But I think there's a case. I know he's only made 3 All-Star teams. I always say this like with players is like if you have 5 All-Star teams and it made at least like 1 All-NBA team in your career, they might as well just get your gold jacket ready right now. Because the bar to get into the Hall of Fame for the NBA, I think because people compare it to like the NFL and the MLB, which is the most absurd Hall of Fame requirement thing I've ever seen. They only have the best player in the history of that sport in the Hall of Fame for whatever reason. But I think because like it's the most lenient, where you have to put that into perspective as well. I think that there are a lot more players from this generation that are going to make the Hall of Fame than people think are. I think Khris Middleton might be one of them. I think Drew Holiday might be one of them. Even though he's only made 1 All-Star team, but he does like all defensive stuff, like, and it's just the impact they have on winning teams. If the Bucks become like the team of this generation, which is very possible they do, they have the best player in the world. They build around him well. If they are the team of this generation, they want like 2, 3, maybe 4 rings on top of what they did in 2021. Which I think is possible. I think they're one of the favorites to win the title right now. Especially with him coming back. I think that would solidify it.
Yeah.
Because I think they would look at like, okay, he's like a 3, 4, maybe 5-time All-Star. He was the number 2, number 3 guy on the team of the decade, of the 2020s.
Right.
Like,
it's very hard to not
Klay
make
Thompson.
the Hall of Fame when you're on like an iconic team like that and you
I
play
think of
such
it like
an integral role.
Like Klay Thompson. I think like because I think Klay Thompson is making it into the Hall of Fame. Like I know people have different opinions. He's going to make the Hall of Fame. Like that's not something I really think about. But again, also Klay Thompson, I didn't know he made 2 All-NBA teams in his career, which kind of shocked me. But Klay Thompson also has the shooting statistical prowess as well. Which Khris Middleton, I'm really shocked to find out like. He has like good 3-point. He doesn't have like an all-time great 3-point shooting season. Like
right, it's just like consistently good.
Well, like other players, it's like Paul George has like one of like the 5 best 3-point shooting seasons ever that no one talks about. So I guess like that, and I would love to see him get into the Hall of Fame. I think like players like this need to be talked about more. I think players in general, like players that even that don't make All-Star teams, deserve to be talked about more because make it to the NBA is an accomplishment of itself. I don't think people realize
for sure
just how hard it is to make it, let alone be a guy that does half of what Khris Middleton's done in his career.
Oh my gosh,
which is always something I like to preach. I'm like, it's why I'm starting to hate the term draft bust because of like once you see the work that goes into like just being a draft pick or being on a radar to be like an undrafted free agent, it's just like it's hard for me to act like you were a disappointment now. I understand everything's in perspective, but it still is hard for me. But yeah, I think Khris Middleton's had a very successful career, one that I think like. There are certain players that people don't realize have as much impact on youth basketball as people think. Like Thaddeus Young, Marvin Williams, where guys look up to those players. People don't realize guys look up to those guys because, everyone at a young age wants to be a star.
Right.
But not everyone will be, and I think, we look at expectations for players. I think Khris Middleton is the expectation that is the baseline expectation you want in a top 3 pick. If you are a top 3 pick and you have his career, that's a successful use of a top 3 pick.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had a lot of fun with this. This is going to be one of the this is the longest video I will ever upload on this channel, probably. And I know I talked about I might have to cut some of it down. I think I won't have to cut as much of this down as I thought I would. Thank you for coming on, man. I really enjoyed this. This is the first time I've ever done something like this. And I didn't know how it would go. You and I have great chemistry together. I think we did one podcast before this, and we talked really well. And obviously, we talk a lot outside of basketball.
Right.
So you were the one I'm okay, I trust you the most to kind of bounce off each other.
A good proof of concept,
And so, do you want to promote anything before we head out?
Not really. Just check out the YouTube channel, AlexHoops. But that's really it. Appreciate you having me on, man. Always a blast. You know I always enjoy it.
Maybe we have to do something like this sometime soon.
Yep. For sure.
Yeah. Also, check out Hustle Points. I'll link to Twitter and in the description below. The YouTube channel, we haven't uploaded anything yet, but I'll link that in the description below. Something that we're both a part of, obviously. That it's hard to explain, but once we fully explain it, you will get it. But it's just more work that you and I are doing outside of our own independent channels that I think. If you enjoyed this video, if you made it to this point, well, thank you, obviously. But if you enjoy what we've talked about in this video, you would enjoy what we are building over there. So I'll link everything that. If you can you send me Matt Isa's article about Versatility?
Yeah, for
I'll
sure.
link that in the description. I'll link Alex's channel. Where to subscribe here. Follow Alex on Twitter. Obviously, follow me on Twitter if you at your own risk. But thank you again. I had a lot of fun with this one. And to you guys who are watching this, I'll see you guys in the next one.